Hey, welcome to our third week in the book of Revelation. I hope you guys are enjoying this format. We're looking forward to getting into the building soon. But in the meantime, I know I've been really enjoying this book with you, and I hope that in your small group formats you've enjoyed looking at it this way as well. 2 weeks ago we saw in Revelation chapter 1 that Christ is among his churches as a priest, but a conquering priest, a glorious, victorious priest. Last week we saw Jesus then address the first of the lampstands, the first church in the church of Ephesus. And we saw in that moment that, that Jesus both commended a strong church like Ephesus, but also had some critique for them as well. We may not be surprised really by that a large and established church, a strong church, could have Jesus' attention. As we move our way into Revelation chapter 2, verse 8, though we saw that last week that the light of Christ is seen in the love of the church, and you'd think about the love of Christ being shown in a strong church like that. Verse 8 turns our attention to a weak church, a church that's suffering. And yet, what we encounter in this second church as Christ turns to his second lampstand is he sees the weakness of the church and he cares for the church in its suffering, but he has nothing to critique. As you're going to hear in just a minute, what Jesus says to the church at Smyrna is only reassuring, only encouraging, and only uplifting. It's really nothing he warns them about, nothing he corrects them for. And it's encouraging to know that that can be given. That can be the status of a church that may not necessarily compare itself to Ephesus and think that they're strong. But in their weakness, there's something beautiful that Jesus is critiquing. Remember one thing that we heard from Alexander Strauch 2 weeks ago. He said this: imagine if Christ were to look down at your church, walk in your midst, and give you his evaluation. It would be unnerving, to say the least. But in a sense, Christ has already done this through the letters to the churches of Asia Minor. He addresses the problems and victories, strengths and weaknesses that are common to local churches today. Therefore, Christ's evaluation of these 7 churches should be of paramount concern to us. I skipped over a slide there that just had these cities for you, and you can kind of see that Smyrna is a coastal town. It's one that as a city was prosperous because of its location here, but you can also see that as Jesus is among these churches, he's moving from Ephesus up to Smyrna, and so he's making his way around this circular route. Well, that said, why don't you pause your video here and have somebody read for you from Revelation chapter 2, verses 8 through 11. All right, welcome back. Well, as we look at, or as we've just heard what Jesus has said to the church at Smyrna, hopefully you heard the echoes of that encouragement there. These words remind me of a moment that happened one New Year's Eve a long time ago when Jace was about 3 years old. We were all down in our basement in the house that the Fitzes live in now, and there was all of us just kind of gathered, watching the TV, getting ready, and all of a sudden we heard this blood-curdling scream, and realized that Jace, who had been sitting on the chair behind me, fell back and hit his head on the stone wall. And in doing that, he had cut his head pretty badly, and so for New Year's Eve, I needed to go to the hospital with Jace. And I remember being in the emergency room as the doctor was about to stitch him up, and he was crying a little bit, but the doctor was kind and let me kind of hold Jace on my chest, and so his face was into me as the doctor was going to work on his head behind. And it went really well until the doctor said to Jace, "Now, hey, everything's okay. This may pinch a little bit." And I'm sure I've told this story before, but at that moment, I remember Jace sort of thinking, yeah, a pinch. I know what a pinch is. I can handle a pinch. Well, all of a sudden, a needle went into that shot. This wasn't a pinch. And Jace, jumped back a little bit and just let out a blood-curdling scream. of just pain, but also betrayal and terror and confusion. Like, you said I was going to pinch, but this isn't a pinch. This really hurts. And I remember at that moment, that sense of feeling like, I know this little guy feels like I lied to him right now. And I wonder if that's a little bit the way the church at Smyrna was hearing Jesus when he said, do not fear what you're about to suffer. It's interesting, right? Because you and I hear suffering as American Christians. Others around the world hear about to suffer, and they hear it differently. So it may not be that worldwide Christians need the kind of reminders that you and I need probably pretty regularly in a life of prosperity. But Matthew chapter 7, right? Remember that in the Sermon on the Mount? We read that the foolish man built his house on the sand, and the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew. And we think, well, of course it did. He was a foolish man, so the rains came against him. But then after that, we read, a wise man built his house on the rock, the rain fell, and the floods came. And you think, wait. Why did the floods come to a wise man? Like, floods should only come to the foolish people, not to the wise. And we realize, no, that's not entirely true. James 1 says, count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds, for you know that the testing of your faith, and then it goes on to talk about what that testing is going to do. And you think, wait, why trials for the brothers? James is saying these are going to be brothers who should count it all joy because they're going to experience trials. And you think, wait, no, God should bring trials to bad people, not trials to the brothers and sisters of the faith, right? We read these passages, and remember, trials come and storms come, and suffering comes because suffering even came to Jesus. And Jesus' words are kind of like the doctor saying, you're going to have tribulation, but don't fear what you're about to suffer. And there's a certain sense that you and I, knowing what's coming up, and even them, I'm thinking, they're going to die. What do you mean don't fear? They're going to die. But even though death is around the corner and prison's around the corner for this church, and there's something really bad that's about to happen for them, and much of this work is going to come about because of the activity of Satan in their church, Jesus still makes a profound point to that church that I think we need to grasp today, and it's that the church will shine like Christ when it suffers like Christ. Because suffering even came to Jesus. And if Jesus would suffer, then we're to suffer. And if we want to shine like Christ, if we want his glory to be radiated out through our lampstand, then the thing we need to remember from Jesus' words to this church is that we can shine like him if we suffer like him. So, as you can already tell, this is going to be an encouraging talk, but it's also going to be a sobering one because we're thinking about the suffering church. We're thinking about the impoverished church, but we're thinking about a commended and faithful church as well. And so these are folks that we want to highlight. So in verse 8 we read this. And to the angel of the church in Smyrna write, the words of the first and the last, who died and came to life. I know your tribulation, and the slander of those who say that they're Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Do not fear what you're about to suffer. Behold, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison, that you may be tested, and for 10 days you will have tribulation. This is a hard one, but I like the way it begins. Jesus saying, here's who I want you to know who's addressing you, who's about to give you this kind of news. It's the one who's the first and the last, who died and who came to life. Jesus is reminding them right out of the gate. He's the Alpha and the Omega. He's the first and the last. He is the one who was before the creation of heaven and earth, before angels were even in existence. He reigned in glory like the Ancient of Days as the Son of Man. He's there in the beginning when light gets separated from darkness, when seas are separated from skies, when dry land appears and then grass and trees, when man first stands upright, when he names all the animals. Jesus is there then. That's what it meant for him to be there as the first. But then he was also there to see the man and his new wife, the representative head of all humanity, listen to the lies of Satan. He was there at the fall of Satan. He was there when sin entered into the world. He then enters into creation so that he could defeat sin. He could defeat death. Which is why he says, I'm the first and the last who died and who came to life. In other words, I've seen all the suffering of my people, and I've understood exactly what's going on. And so the first point that really comes out of this is that Jesus sees his suffering church. Jesus is the one who knew everything that his church was gonna go through and was going to deal with. This moment of Jesus entering into creation. Consider the way that C.S. Lewis talks about it in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. It says, at last she, this is the White Witch, drew near. She stood by Aslan's head. Her face was working and twitching with passion. But his looked up at the sky, still and quiet, neither angry nor afraid, but a little sad. Then just before she gave the blow, she stooped down and said in a quivering voice, and now who has won? Fool, did you think that by all this you would save the human traitor? Now I will kill you instead of him, as our pact was, and so the deep magic will be appeased. But when you are dead, what will prevent me from killing him as well? Who will take him out of my hand then? Understand that you have given me Narnia forever. You have lost your own life and not saved his. In that knowledge, despair and die. It's a unique portrayal of the moment of Christ's death. And it's a reminder, it's a graphic reminder, that the one who calls us to suffer has himself suffered first. It's why he could say, of all those who were of faith, he could say that some were tortured, this is Hebrews 11, refusing to accept release, so that they might rise again to a better life. Others suffered mocking and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two. They were killed with the sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, mistreated, of whom the world was not worthy. The reason that Jesus can make these kinds of statements and can gather them into this category of folks of whom the world is not worthy, much like himself, is because he tasted death and he tasted suffering and he overcame. Again, here's the way Lewis says it. At that same table, it said the rising of the sun had made everything look so different. All colors and shadows, and for a moment they didn't see the important thing. Then they did. The stone table was broken into two pieces by a great crack that ran down it from end to end. And there was no Aslan. Who's done it? Cried Susan. What does it mean? Is it magic? Yes, said a great voice behind their backs. It is more magic. They looked round, and there, shining in the sunrise, larger than they had seen him before, stood Aslan himself. Now this changed the rest of the story and the rest of the Bible, didn't it? When Jesus was raised again by the Father and defeated death, everything about the story changed. Not just about his suffering, but about ours as well. And that's why he can say, as the first and the last, as the one who's died and who's come back to life, I know your suffering. So Jesus sees the suffering church. He knows what's going on, and he's able to give a grand narrative over that because he sees their suffering. But it's not just that Jesus sees the suffering church. The second thing that Jesus is doing here, if we look back at verse 9, is that Jesus can redefine an impoverished church. Listen to these words, and I've put them in bold here. This is the part that I skipped over before. He says, I know your tribulation and the slander of those who say they're not Jews. But he also says this, I know your tribulation and your poverty. But, he says, you are rich. Jesus is redefining for this impoverished church what's going on. Now, look, we have this. It's being recorded for you. You're watching it on bigger TVs probably. We're surrounded by luxury. We're the richest country in the richest time of history. We're not impoverished. Now, relatively, some of us can be more or less than others, without a doubt. But I think we need this reminder as much as this warning. Now, Jesus is speaking to this impoverished church and reminding them of something, that they're rich. And I think in that commendation that he's giving to them, in that encouragement that he's giving to them, we need to soberly remember that, as a friend of mine once said, it's not poverty to be poor. And that's the point that Jesus is making here. He knows of your poverty, but really don't forget, you are vastly wealthy. And God needs to remind us of the difference between having material possessions and being truly rich. And sometimes he'll strip away those material possessions and so that we get our focus back on what is true, what is real. And the people with limited riches can miss this. But sometimes the people with great wealth are more prone to miss it. That our greatest debt isn't the lack of something that we possess or don't possess here physically. Our greatest debt is what Christ was able to cover at Calvary. It's what he covered at the cross. There was a time where we had some friends over, and the kids were little, but not as little as they had once been. And we were sitting out on the porch, and they were doing some things for us. And we were just hanging out, and the kids asked, could we get you a drink? And so we said, yeah, sure, that would be really nice. And so they kind of took to serving us for a little while. They brought us some food and brought us drinks and things along those lines. And then afterwards, one of the little ones came and said, hey, we were just really nice to you. Could you pay us? And at one point in time, what I probably could have done is just reached down, taken 5 coins and said, here you go, we paid you. And they, feeling the weight of those coins in their hand, would have said, oh, this is wonderful, we're rich. And I'm only up, the value of a nickel because I gave them 5 pennies. This wasn't one of those times, and so I couldn't pull the wool over their eyes. Why? Because they'd matured, right? They'd grown into knowing what real wealth is and what false wealth is. I say that a little bit in jest. Obviously, they knew the value of 5 pennies and 5 quarters and $5. But what's interesting, right, is that for us, most of the time as we mature, we don't become more aware of what's valuable and less valuable. We become more deceived. The prosperity that's around us actually blinds us to what's real wealth. And it tricks us into trading away what we really ought to be pursuing for the sake of those things that are of lesser value. Brad preached a message on this a long while ago that I'll try to put into our email here and just remind you of, because I think it was really helpful in terms of helping us to just kind of keep this in front of us. But here's just a couple verses that I think might be of some encouragement to you. Read this in 2 Corinthians chapter 8. It says, you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that you by his poverty might become rich. Now, Paul isn't speaking at all of material possessions there, is he? He's speaking of the glory that was Christ's, that Jesus voluntarily gave up. He gave up being recognized and identified by everything that marked him in heaven, and instead took on our form. Why? So that we wouldn't have to be known by this form anymore. We wouldn't have to be branded and identified with this false wealth anymore, but that instead we could truly experience what real riches are. The warning, the opposite, really, that comes to one of the other churches, the Laodiceans, is found in Revelation chapter 3, and they read this. They hear Jesus say this to them. You say I'm rich, I've prospered, and I need nothing, not realizing that you are wretched, pitiable, poor, blind, and naked. In other words, where the people of Smyrna are being encouraged, and where they're being reminded of the wealth that they truly possess, Jesus is correcting the Laodiceans here. We're going to hear this again, obviously, in a number of weeks. But the question I think all of us need to ask is, if the Lord puts us in seasons, or even before he puts us in seasons, where some of our wealth dries up, or where we're called to give it away, will we struggle to keep our minds on what's really, truly real? That by possessing Christ, we have everything that we need. And even if suffering comes, even if being impoverished happens, even if Jesus might need to say, I know you're suffering and I know your poverty, that he could also remind us at the same time, but you're rich. I know you're suffering and things have been taken. I know you're struggling and you don't have everything that you want or everything that you think you need, but remember this, we're connected. You're found in me, and so you're as rich as you need to be. See, you may hear that and think, I just don't even know. Who could really see or say that? Do you really know my situation? Let me just remind you of the one who's speaking. Here's the way he was described in Revelation chapter 1. The hairs of his head were white, like white wool, like snow. His eyes were like a flame of fire. His feet were like burnished bronze, refined in a furnace, and his voice was like the roar of many waters. In other words, the one who has the authority to speak this way has the authority also to remind us that he sees everything perfectly. He's the only one who understands our situation. He's the only one who has been able to see what's going on in our lives. And so he's the only one who can speak with this kind of authority. Now, the third point that we get to as we come out of this is that not only does Jesus see us and redefine our situations in the middle of our suffering and in the middle of our poverty, but thirdly, Jesus is able to reward his faithful church. Regardless of how much suffering comes, regardless of how much is taken from them, when we're found to be faithful, there's a reward that Jesus promises. Here's what it is. He says in verse 10, be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. The one who conquers will not be hurt by the second death. This is the reminder that we need. And it was the reminder that the church in Smyrna was really going to need. That God would address them this way was timely. Incredibly timely. Because their command that they heard from him was don't fear and be faithful. Be found faithful at the end and don't be taken by fear. The context of that command was going to be in the form of their suffering, even suffering that was going to take away what little wealth that they had. And they understood that this was going to come from the devil, it was going to involve prison, and it was likely going to involve death. Here's what we read later on, another teaser to something later on in Revelation. It says, I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ have come. For the accuser of our brothers has been thrown down, who accuses them day and night before our God. And they have conquered him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. For they loved not their lives, even to death. Therefore rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in them. But woe to you, O earth and sea, for the devil has come down to you in great wrath, because he knows that his time is short. This is a wonderful picture that the church in Smyrna was going to be able to hear later, and that they were desperately going to need. Woe was coming. The devil and his fury was coming against that church, and they were going to suffer, and they were going to suffer hard. But there was rejoicing going on in heaven at that very moment. And if they could hear with their eyes the vision of heaven and be able to remember what was going on, they would be able to remain faithful into death. Interestingly enough, John, who was in Ephesus, you remember the map, had a disciple of his who took over and really, tradition says he really ran the church later on in Smyrna. Polycarp is this guy's name. He had never really met Jesus, but he knew men like John who did know Jesus. And so he was a friend of the eyewitnesses who was leading that church later on. Trouble is that suffering really did come upon the church. And listen to this account of what life was like later on in Smyrna. It says, eyewitness accounts from this time highlight the public brutality of the persecution. Believers were lashed until their muscles were laid bare, forced to lie down on shards of shells, and thrown into arenas to be devoured by wild animals in front of townspeople. There are striking examples of early martyrs welcoming these sufferings in the name of Christ. One even embraced a wild beast and pulled it toward himself to meet death as quickly as possible. Eventually, the crowd took up the refrain, "Away with the atheists, go find Polycarp." Now, atheist was a popular term for Christians who, in denying the Roman divinities in favor of a God who couldn't be seen, were thought of as atheists. Having captured Polycarp, Herod tried to convince him to save himself. "Why, what harm in there," Herod said, is found in saying Caesar is Lord and offering incense. When Polycarp refused the very suggestion of renouncing Christ, Polycarp marched on quickly as they escorted him to a stadium, where a deafening roar arose from the throngs of spectators. As he entered, his Christian companions heard a voice from above saying, "Be strong, Polycarp, and play the man." He was brought before the proconsul, who urged him to deny his faith and bow before the emperor. "Swear by the spirit of Caesar, repent and say, 'Away with the atheists.'" Turning with a grim look toward the crowd, calling for his death, Polycarp gestured at them. "Away with the atheists," he said dryly. "Don't you know I have wild beasts waiting? I'll throw you to them unless you repent." Polycarp answered, "Bring them on then, for we are not accustomed to repent of what is good in order to adopt that which is evil." So the proconsul sent his herald out into the arena to announce that Polycarp had confessed to being a Christian. At this, the assembled crowd seethed with uncontrolled fury and called for Polycarp to be burned alive. Quickly they assembled a pyre, gathering wood from workshops and the public baths. Polycarp removed his clothes and tried to take off his shoes, though his advanced age made it difficult. His guards prepared to nail him to the stake, but he told them calmly, "Leave me as I am, for the one who gives me strength to endure the fire will also give me strength to remain at the stake unmoved without being secured by nails." He bound his hands behind him. Polycarp offered a psalm of praise and thanksgiving to God, and his captors ignited the wood. There's a story of Polycarp. Polycarp had a disciple named Irenaeus, who the Lord would use later on in church history to really battle some serious heresies that arose early. In fact, this guy would write one of the books his book was called Against Heresies. So much of the doctrine that we've gone through as a church over our last 2 years, it came about because of men like Irenaeus. It came about because of men like Polycarp. And it came about because of a church like Smyrna, who was willing to suffer, who was willing to endure poverty and harm and real trial and real tribulation, who was willing to be found faithful unto death, knowing that the glory and the dominion of God wouldn't die with their church. Guys, I've got some suggestions for you in terms of how you ought to, or how you could, close this time. I know that we in the barn are going to take time to pray for our friends in Nepal that are suffering greatly right now, and to take some time to pray for the persecuted church in general. And I'd recommend that you guys do something similar to that. So why don't one of you, in closing our time right now, just pray for us, and then I think your leader is going to lead you through some time of prayer that way as well. Thanks.